So hi everyone, I'm Bethan Timmins. I'm the Managing Director of Equal Experts in Australia and New Zealand. I just want to welcome everyone to Expert Talks Online today. So we have visitors on this meetup from all around the world, as I've said to you. So whether you are eating your breakfast in the UK, or whether you're having your lunch in India, or you've just finished your dinner here in Australia or New Zealand, a big welcome to all of you. So for those of you who haven't actually been to an Expert Talks before, our events are held by Equal Experts that invites all of the community together to kind of share some of your learnings and share ideas, and just to give you inspiration really, and have discussion issues around and learn from each other. We want to celebrate some of the successes and the failures that everyone's experienced, and really doing that using real case studies. So Equal Experts is a network of experienced software practitioners. If you haven't heard of us before, we specialize in agile and continuous delivery. Our approach is about bringing maturity, pragmatism, and passion to the way we deliver software projects. And we do that of all shapes and sizes. So whether that's everything from mobile apps to huge enterprise level technology. So a little bit more. So for the months of October and November, we've actually invited some of our clients to talk at Expert Talks. And today I'm really excited to welcome Rohan Berry from Big W. So Big W is one of Australia's largest and well-known retailers. Big W recognises that need to be digital first business and sees online as a major contributor, not only to its growth, but to the service it can offer communities and its customers. And Equal Experts have been working with Big W for over a year now, and they really aim to deliver software in a rapid, sustainable and automated fashion. Big W is going through that digital transformation to go from a current monolith architecture to an event-driven microservices architecture. And then that will lead me nicely into Rohan himself. Rohan Berry is the head of digital IT at Big W. Rohan's been leading that technology transformation for the last couple of years now, and his team is responsible for the technology that enables Big W Online customer experience and all the supporting processes to deliver on that promise. That includes demand generation, content management, conversion of orders, fulfillment and delivery of orders, and all the associated customer service. It isn't a small task, is it, Rohan? So Rohan's going to share with us tonight on what Big W are trying to achieve in terms of their delivery outcomes and the architectural changes that are supporting this, and just the experiences that they've had so far. So lastly, just before I hand over to Rohan, can I ask if you have any questions, just to add them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and Andy and I will help facilitate some of those questions towards the end. Over to you now, Rohan.
Thank you, Bethan, and welcome everyone. Awesome to have such a sort of multicultural and global involvement in tonight's call. A little bit more background first, I guess, on Big W, just so that you've got the context, and then I've got a presentation that I'll talk through that just shares the story from where we were, where we're up to now, and where we sort of eventually want to try and get to, and what some of the key learnings have been along the way. So as Bethan described, Big W, part of the Woolworths Group, which is the largest retailer in Australia. In itself, Big W is sort of a circa 4 billion a year turnover retail business, known as what's called discount department store. So we have 180 odd stores around Australia, and they typically range somewhere in the order of 100,000 SKUs. And by being a discount department store, it means we're covering a very broad range of categories. So some of the complexities that come with our business is both the breadth of that range and the different types of products that we're dealing with. So it might be, there's a lot of apparel, we've got some food, we've got toys, games, electronics, even sort of home furnishings and the like. So really broad spectrum of products, very broad spectrum of customers that we're dealing with. And that brings quite a lot of complexity into what we need to do to operate effectively as a retailer, and to then bring that to life in the digital world. The vision of Big W is actually to become a digital retailer that's supported by a great store network. And so this sort of technology transformation I'm about to talk through is really foundational to achieving that vision. What it also means, though, is we've got an interesting model in that we are not looking to try and rely on centralized distribution centers for all of our fulfillment. We actually believe that our distributed store network creates a competitive advantage for us compared to the pure plays. And that's on a couple of fronts. The first is it means we've got points of presence that are much closer to customers to be able to more quickly fulfill on their demand. It also means that we've got people that provide a very, very high level of customer service if people do need to perform returns or come back to stores. And it means we're leveraging the inventory and the processes that are already in place. So that's sort of the broad context for the business before I start to go into the technology. So let me share the screen and we'll start to go through that story. Okay, let me just figure out how to move these things around. Okay, so first little thing, we're very proud. We've actually just rebranded and badged ourselves as Big WX as a digital team, which is, I guess, trying to signify the importance that this part of our organisation is going to be playing in the sort of the next level of performance and customer experience that Big W is going for. As I said, what I wanted to share tonight, this morning, depending on where you are, is sort of what our starting point was, what some of the pain points and problems were that we're experiencing as we experience extraordinary growth, as many retailers are in the online channel. And certainly in the few years I've been with the business, we've grown by several orders of magnitude. It's just been an extraordinary level of growth. And that's definitely put a number of things under significant strain. And I'll explain why that then led us to rethinking our architecture and the technologies we use. Talk a little bit about the principles that we've sort of agreed and have been trying to apply through that journey, the vision of where we want to get to, and what that translates to in terms of sort of a conceptual end state. Share a little bit about the method that we're using to try and get there using agile and iterative methods, where we're up to now in terms of some of the changes and the outcomes that's supporting. And finally, I guess a little bit of a sharing of what some of the challenges and key learnings have been on the journey to date. So the starting point. We implemented a system called SAP Hybris several years ago, which was a really fast, cost-effective way of getting Big W into the game of e-commerce. So it was sort of right decision at the time and in the context. However, what we've been experiencing in the last couple of years is some significant pain, and a lot of that is quite directly related to that monolithic architecture. What we find is that when we experience the peak trade periods, and for us that's twice a year, we have a big toy sale event halfway through the year, and then obviously we've got Christmas. But during those periods, we're putting our entire infrastructure under extraordinary loads. And what we're finding was that we're actually getting to the limits of where we could scale out and scale up. And that was starting to have quite a detrimental effect on customers. So that experience in terms of performance frustrated customers, but also what we started to find is that the complexities that were being built into that monolithic application were creating inconsistencies in the customer experience that they were also unhappy with, and that would end up being quite complex for us to find and solve. We also found that the ways that we had to try and make changes would frustrate the other parts of our business that we're trying to support. You know, one of the classic examples I shared with our exec team when we're talking through this is that our typical life cycle working with that monolith was, you know, we'd be performing 2-week sprints, and it would at the end of that, we'd need to go through really significant user acceptance testing, regression testing, performance testing. So ultimately, it meant that at best, you're really looking at probably a 3-week to 4-week cycle time from an idea or a requirement being tabled to actually being able to get it safely into production. And that meant that whether it was a major change or something as simple as fixing a typo that had actually been built into the code rather than via the CMS, we'd be looking at a 3 to 4 week window of work. And you can imagine as you start to get this big backlog of requirements, and many of them to the business team seem trivial in nature, and yet would have all of this effort, all this energy and all this time being consumed to try and get them through. That ultimately led to my team feeling very frustrated as well, because they're putting in enormous hours, lots of energy and effort, but they're feeling this constant friction every time they're trying to do anything. And again, even the simplest changes tended to be complex because we had this web of business logic built into the application. So a relatively small change in one area, it would actually take a long time to understand where throughout these millions of lines of code that would potentially have impacts. And therefore everyone was a little bit nervous when you'd actually be taking something through to production as to whether we really had fully understood it and tested it to go live successfully. The other bit that made it quite frustrating for our team is that a lot of the changes, in fact, almost every release in that world that we were going through involved database schema changes. And so what that meant is when we wanted to do a release, we'd actually have to take the entire website down. So it was not practical in most scenarios to do a zero downtime outage or zero customer impact outage. So, we'd have our teams up every fortnight, basically from, circa 11 PM through to 4 AM or whatever it was, having to make all of these changes and having to put up an apology site for our customers while we did it. That architecture also meant that it was quite difficult to leverage new services and solutions because all of the elements that we had were very, very tightly coupled and linked. So if you wanted to try and, if someone else in the group or we found another third-party service that was going to meet a very specific need and generate a new experience that we wanted to test out, it wasn't possible to quickly, easily test that impact. You actually had to do quite a lot of significant surgery to figure out how you were going to inject that new bit of capability into the application. Ultimately, what that meant was that we're starting to actually create diseconomies of scale. And that's, I guess, what I'm reflecting a little bit with these diagrams up the top is the more squads that I actually brought into the team to try and accelerate progress, actually, the more contention that we were creating, the more performance and infrastructure problems that we were creating. And actually the whole thing was just starting to become a logjam. And the ability to support what we knew our customers wanted and what we knew our business needed was becoming increasingly difficult. So that was kind of the genesis for why we needed to look at doing something quite differently. And it led us to then having a bit of a conversation around what were the principles that we wanted to explore and what were the options. And very quickly, one option would be, cool, go and buy another big package that would do it all. We fairly quickly discounted that because the reality is that a business of the size and complexity of Big W that is trying to be at the forefront of customer experience is always going to be wanting to test and trial and learn with different business logic, different customer experience, different store experience. And very quickly you start to go outside the bounds of what's been built into a standard package in those areas. And as soon as you start doing that, you lose all the benefits from that stock standard package. So that sort of option in terms of a silver bullet solution quite quickly got knocked out of the running. So objectives and principles for this change. From an objectives and success criteria perspective, what we're looking at is how do we ensure this is going to be a secure solution, because we're starting to find a few areas that were not as robust in that area as we wanted. How do we make sure it's going to have the reliability we need? Starting to look at principles around self-healing, much better tracking of customer behavior and activity and how that then gets reflected in the application and getting to a point where you could automate recovery. Ensuring that the solution is very scalable and performant, that it's cost effective in its total life cycle, and that we're able to achieve the flexibility and speed and delivery that we're looking for. So those are sort of the headline objectives that we set for ourselves. In terms of principles then for making the right technology and architecture choices, the first one for us is always what's actually going to matter most to customers. So there are some elements of the technology and architecture that are not really going to matter as much for customers or for team. So for those ones, cost is going to be a much, and total cost of ownership will be a much stronger driver of the decision making. But for those things that very directly and visibly change customers' experience and perception, those are the ones that we really want to invest in from an innovation and flexibility perspective. The second one was to keep pragmatic and commercial, because you can very quickly end up either applying idealistic architectural thinking, or trying to gold coat everything, and either taking far too long or spending far too much money. And as a discount department store, we need to be very lean in the way we go about delivering things and making sure that every investment we're making is going to have a very direct financial return for us. The next one for us was this concept of borrow, buy, build, which is I guess, particularly relevant for us because we're part of that bigger Woolworths group. So the concept here is, if someone else has already solved the problem and come up with a great solution, don't spend the time looking at a whole bunch of other options or trying to create it yourself. Just borrow it, particularly if you can consume it as a service. The second is that if you can't borrow something that the group has already created, then before you fire up an engineering team to go build it, look at whether you can meet all of the critical business requirements with a stock standard off-the-shelf package, because that will be a really easy and low-cost thing to maintain. When neither of those are going to actually meet the requirements, and particularly where it's going to make that difference to customer, that's when we build, and that's where our engineering teams focus. The next one, which has been a bit of an evolution, and we don't always get right, but is I guess to keep trying to encourage the principle that we should be directionally right and accept that we'll specifically often be wrong. And as long as the next couple of points around evolvability, testability, and deployability hold true, then being specifically wrong from time to time is actually not going to matter. But if we've got that clear vision of directionally where we're trying to get to, what success looks like, then actually making progress and learning along the way is far more important than trying to boil the ocean to come up with a theoretically 100% right answer. Being able to apply that principle, though, very much ties to the last one, which is making sure that every element of software we build ticks the boxes of evolvability, testability, and deployability. So what I mean by that is, it should be, if we get something wrong, it should be trivial to adjust it and refine it. That shouldn't be a case of having to go back to square one every time and fundamentally rethink, redesign, rebuild. We should be able to iterate and evolve as we learn what works and what doesn't. The second is testability, and it's a key shift in the thinking and the mindset for our team. We've come from a world where everything was very manual in terms of testing, and what we wanted to get to is a point where we're as close as practical to 100% automation in the testing, so that the cycle times and the level of resource are significantly reduced. And the final one is that deployability. So as I said, we're coming from a world of 2 to 3 week cycle times at best. We wanted to be able to get to that intraday deployment on the back of that automation. So those were the things that were top of mind for us. So the vision was to take the best of cloud services and microservices, so that we could get to that scalability that I described, that each element could be individually scalable, both horizontally and vertical. We weren't sort of stuck in the environment that we were coming from, where, for example, we had one single database that every element of the application was going to potentially become bottlenecked on, but we could actually break those elements out. To use technologies that would significantly improve end user speed, because we know that drives better conversion rates for customers. And the coupling of our front and back ends in the old architecture made that very difficult to achieve. I've talked about this as the faster delivery via more modular, independent components rather than that monolith. The other one, which is a bit of a tricky one, we've found as a tricky one as you go into this world, is ideally trying to define each solution in a much simpler way. An example of that for us is we have a core element of our original solution, which is called sourcing and availability, which ultimately drives what customers see as available to buy and where they're then going to be fulfilled from amongst the stores. Now that logic was hundreds of thousands of lines of custom code, and the time that it took for someone to actually understand all of that logic was extreme. And so if they wanted to make a change to it, it was never a simple, trivial exercise. What you'll see in here is we've gone to a point of breaking that up into these much simpler microservices, so that each one is performing a very specific purpose. It's bounded, it's independent, so it makes it much easier for people to quickly understand what it's doing and why and how. And if they need to make a change to that therefore the risk, the time, the effort is significantly reduced. And as long as they hold true that as long as the contracts between the elements are not adjusted, they can do that with confidence that it's not going to break anything else. The other one for us that was important was getting to modern tools and processes. So as we've been growing as a business, we've obviously been trying to get more people and higher caliber people into the team. And what we're finding was that the tools and the processes were often in the old world becoming a constraint on attracting the best talent. So we wanted something from a technology perspective that would, excite and inspire the best people to come and work with us. And the final one was to have that flexibility in being able to grab whatever was working really well elsewhere in the world or in the group and plug that in and make use of it. And the principle here is that we grab where we can, we'll use those cloud-based services, and I'll share a few of those. And where we're going to build, we'll build them as microservices. And if we do that, we then sort of go from that logjam scenario to having lots of engineering squads that can be running at pace with a high degree of independence. Sort of that super highway concept, and whether it's customers or team, we're getting to people that are actually really positive, energized, and feeling good about what's happening in the big W digital world. Won't labour this one too much, but conceptual view of starting point is we had SAP Hybris. It was like 80 to 90% of our entire world. It supported the entire customer journey, the entire order fulfillment journey, customer service, email management, payment, orchestration, you name it, pretty much was in that one large application. We had a couple of sort of add-on services, linkages into Facebook, eBay, Google, and some specialist services that would help with recommendations or campaign management. But the vast majority of it was in that single application. By applying the principles I described, what we got to, I guess, was first of all conceptually this idea of starting to create a bit of a mesh of different microservices and cloud services that would be across, each of which would be very focused on a particular business domain or functional area, each of which would have a clear definition of its boundary and its relationship to other services, so that we could start to better manage versioning and integration between each of those elements. And then we'd have other services like identity or email that were then supporting those business-oriented functions. What we then started to look at was how do we then decompose the business areas and start to then line up a roadmap around what were either those cloud services or microservices that we would use to fulfill both the current and then future business needs. So I'll share, I guess, some of the decisions we've made along the way, and then start to talk through how we've been working through that transformation. So at the top level, we look at how our customers and store teams interact with us from a digital perspective. Storefront is fundamentally the website, www.bigw.com.au, custom app being our native app, and then what we're looking to in the future will be a sort of a store version of the app. So for our store team members and associates that are doing the picking, the packing, answering customer queries and the like, to also be able to access all of the rich content and information that's in our digital ecosystem. And for all of those, because they are so specific to the experience of those internal and external customers, they're things that will be strategic differentiators, and therefore we want to have a very high level of control and a very a great degree of flexibility in terms of how we make changes. And so those are ones we've decided we'll definitely build ourselves. From a storefront perspective, we've gone down the path of building a single page app in React. We will build native apps in the coming months across both iOS and Android, and then we'll eventually build an equivalent set of store apps. So storefront piece is well underway, and within a few months we'll launch that. Customer app starts in a few months, and then following that will be store app. One that at the moment we haven't lent into, but we will need to, is the API and event management. So far we've been building specific APIs and managing those effectively point to point, but we can see that we're quite soon going to get to the tipping point where the benefits that come from a more orchestrated integration layer will actually outweigh the cost of both buying, implementing and managing that environment. So we've started to get a couple of the teams to pull together the options and come up with a recommendation for what that should look like in coming months. The green areas are the ones where we're looking to primarily borrow, but in some cases augment with a build from elsewhere in the group. So we've got some great solutions already in the group for managing identity across customers and internal team members. So we'll basically borrow those. We'll just plug, use those as services, put our data into them, and we'll call APIs by from our new applications to solve that identity requirement. Likewise, there's a huge amount of investment that our sort of brother and sister organisations have been putting into personalisation. So again, we're working with them to have those turned into services that we can just consume, so that we're not needing to design, build and maintain those ourselves. Search is a really important one for us. That's one of the most important aspects of the digital journey whenever we talk to our customer groups. Still unsure at this stage the extent to which we'll be able to borrow what others in the group have done versus what we'd buy. So we're doing a bit more work over that over the next couple of months. The one I'm certainly very interested in is where Google are going with search as a service. They're clearly at the forefront of overall web search. So if those sort of capabilities genuinely are going to be made available as a service for websites, then that could be a really compelling option and something we'll look into more. Pricing and promotions will be a combination for us of building and buying. There's a level of this that actually builds off what's happening in the personalisation front. So we will borrow that from the group, but there are also a number of elements that we're going to need to build out ourselves to make sure that the combinations of products and offers that we have in the DDS market can all be supported. Payments is one we'll borrow because Woolworths Group has actually invested very heavily in payment gateways. Email marketing, we will use a combination of borrow and buy. Customer ties in very much to the personalisation and then that sort of personalised pricing and promotion. So there'll be a level of borrowing there, but we'll also need to buy some improved customer relationship management capabilities as cloud-based services. Delivery, in the immediate term, we've actually partnered with an organisation called ShipIt. So we've built out the delivery orchestration services on our side, but we're then making use of ShipIt as effectively a consolidation service. So we have one point of integration, and they then look after the myriad of different freight companies and couriers that we need to work with across the country that offer a variety of different services. Order management and customer service is one that we're going to be sort of facing into in the next sort of 9 months or so. So we'll need to figure out whether that's a buy or borrow. Two of the areas that Equal Experts have been very heavily involved in and that we've been incrementally delivering over the last several months are sourcing and availability. So these again are quite fundamental to our business model and our areas that we want to keep being able to fine tune the business rules and the logic. So we've gone down the microservices build path for both of these domains. And that's working out very well for us in terms of the speed at which we're now starting to deliver new convenience options to customers and the rate at which we can deploy those changes. Syndication and specialist services is not going to change dramatically, and likewise for enterprise services. I have to move the block here. On the right-hand side, we've got a number of the areas where we'll predominantly be buying. So we will need to replace our product information management solution. So that's one where we are hoping we'll be able to get something off the shelf that meets all of our key criteria. We've partnered with Google to make use of their capabilities across that whole reporting and analytics space. So, big query to hold and do all the transformation work, and then using a combination of Google Data Studio and Tableau for the front end of things. We've partnered with Adobe to make use of the AEM suite for content management and digital asset management, and then Workfront for the marketing workflow management. So that sort of hopefully gives a little bit of an idea of the way we look at the moving parts and how we're using the best of cloud-based services where they're a good fit and they're available, and then building out specific microservices where they're going to make a strategic difference and where we need more ongoing control. Cool. Okay, so how do we actually work our way through this? equal experts played a really significant part in sort of forming the approach and the strategy for what's quite a complex transition. And it's all about this concept of strangling out the components from the monolith. And the next slide starts to bring to life how we're actually going about doing that. So we go through a multi-stage process each time we want to strangle an element out. The first is, I guess, identifying what's the capability. So, that example I just shared it might be the availability of inventory in each store. So that's a capability that currently, or that used to exist in the Hybris world. So the first thing we do is actually create an abstraction layer within Hybris itself, so that all of the other functionality, service and codes that are going to remain in Hybris are not going to know that we're about to actually strangle out that particular functionality and capability. Once we've got the abstraction layer in place and everything else can continue pointing to that, we're then able to decouple it. So we're able to build that new set of microservices that replace that functionality and capability outside the monolith. Everything else, from in this case, Hybris perspective, still behaves in the same way. So we've sort of de-risked the change while getting the benefit of the new architecture. And in our case, these microservices are now running on Kubernetes clusters, currently in the AWS environment. Once we've carved out that new capability, the beauty is we can then make sure that any new services that we're building as part of our solution evolution point to that, rather than having to be integrated back into that more complicated and harder to change monolith. So that's sort of at a very simplistic level, the process that we go through to carve out and strangle out each of the elements, with the intent that over time we take them all out and we're eventually left with just a shell that can be decommissioned at the end of the exercise. So where are we now? Well, we've got a number of services live. So we've got iterations of availability, sourcing, delivery management. We also, during our recent toy sale, introduced a new service for our e-lay-by, which allows people to sort of effectively put a down payment and then make a number of installments to eventually get their stock. And the really nice thing from a general business, customer and commercial perspective is that our evolvability, testability and deployability targets are all being achieved. So we've gone from that world of 2 to 3 weeks minimum to actually go from idea to production change or increment, with multi-hour outages being required every time we did it, to a situation where we are now having multiple deployments occur every single day in production, with no outages, no disruptions. Now at the moment, we've started off with a level of manual intervention control. So we still sort of have a formal checkpoint to say, are we clear on what we're changing? Are we clear on the impact? Are we happy to do it? Yes, we are. Cool, let's go. The vision is we'll get to a point where there's a much higher degree of automation and we don't need those same manual steps. But compared to where we were just several months ago, that's an extraordinary level of improvement, and is what gives us the confidence to sort of not only continue but accelerate the process of transitioning the rest of our solution stack and architecture to this new world. So then to a few of the challenges and learnings, and then I guess I open it up for some of the questions that I imagine some of this will have generated. So from my perspective, a really fundamental thing was making sure that the non-technology teams and parts of the organisation really understood and bought into the strategy and the change approach. We've had a lot and continue to have a lot of hard trade-off discussions. Because obviously to have such significant amounts of the team capacity focused on carving these services out and building them into the new architecture means that same capacity is not going into delivering brand new features and functions and experiences. And even if budget were not an issue, the reality is we've got to slow down the level of change in the old world, because otherwise you can never catch up. If the target is moving away from you faster than you're catching up, then it's a no-win game. So having that level of understanding and support has been fundamental to the successes we've had so far. The other is that investing the time to get the foundations right. In our case, that was particularly around the automation frameworks, the way we set up the Kubernetes clusters, the way that we set up that, in our case, a sort of a new AWS account, that where that all of that new infrastructure and application environment would be stood up, it was a lot of work, a lot of discussions, and it took probably longer than we initially thought that it would. But getting those in place then allows you to move at a much faster rate once you've got over there. The other is, I guess, is often the case with any of these sort of changes, but it definitely gets harder before it gets easier. I can see light at the end of the tunnel, but we're still in the it's getting harder before it gets easier phase. And that's the juggle between maintaining the old environment, continuing to deliver some changes and improvements to that old environment, and trying to stand up a very new, different technology and way of working, means that people's brains are just being pulled in multiple directions at all times, and that definitely adds to the complexity. The other one that particularly chatting with our lead solution architect, he encouraged me to talk to was that for anyone who hasn't already sort of embarked on this journey and is contemplating, just make sure you're really clear on what you're trying to achieve with the architectural change, and that microservices really are going to give you the right trade-offs and overall net outcomes. They're certainly the buzzword, and everyone gets very excited when you talk about trying to move to a microservices architecture. I've found when hiring people, it's quite bemusing at times, the different definitions people will give you of what they think a microservices architecture really is, and where and when it would make sense, and where and when perhaps it won't make sense. It's certainly from our experience, it's a complex, expensive thing to try and transition to and to maintain. And you need quite a high caliber and competency level in your team to get the most out of it. But if you can get those competencies and capabilities in place, and if you're going to get the benefits from the sort of speed of change and the extent of parallel activity that microservices support, then they become a no-brainer. You just got to make sure that there really is going to be the benefit from that side of the equation to balance out the cost and complexity that comes with both the transition and then having to manage a lot more moving parts in the overall equation. Because I've talked to the fact that it's big complex change, always the case, but trying to get that combination of what's sort of the big, hairy, audacious goals in terms of what we wanted to achieve and how we, challenge ourselves to go after those as fast as we possibly can, but to then actually break it back down into, the smallest possible changes with low risk services and implementations, so that you can actually build the learnings, you can tune the application. Like there was a classic example that actually came up today where, there was a particular character set that was being disallowed in part of our infrastructure. Finding that with a simple low risk service meant that was not a big deal. If we'd sort of bet the house on the launch of a particular service that had then flushed that out, that would have been a much more stressful and challenging sort of process to go through. One of the ones that we're still, I'd say, early to midway through the maturity curve on, but is trying to apply those agile principles. And for us, there's a couple of things that particularly come to mind there. The first is making sure that the delivery squads are very clear on what are the customer or store impacting outcomes that they're actually trying to support, and trying to set them up so that they've got enough capability and enough influence and control over what they're changing that they can actually take genuine ownership of achieving that outcome. We often have tension within our team around where it would in some cases be easier to take horizontal slices of the technology and the architecture. And whenever we've gone too far down that path, we've then ended up with pain and frustration, because there's ambiguity around who really owns the outcome, who understands how all of the bits are actually going to fit together. So sort of trying to get to that, in alignment with the microservices architecture concept, that you've got these small, well-defined, clearly bounded services and domains that are linked to a particular customer or business outcome makes this journey a lot easier. The other one that we've found, and part of it comes, I guess, from the history of how we've managed and maintained our environment over the last few years, is that data and testing capabilities across the legacy system quite quickly become a constraint on how quickly you can actually drive the change. The combination of stores, products, customers, offers, it creates huge numbers of permutations in terms of customer flows and store flows for us. Setting up the data and getting to a point where there are reasonable levels of automation in sort of validating that as we carve things out, we haven't broken anything in the legacy world, and then being able to validate that we can get consistent outcomes in the new world is taking quite a lot of sort of brain cycles within our team. There's still one where we haven't quite yet crunched, but we're going to need to in the next couple of months to get the next level of acceleration that we're looking for. Linked to all of that is building teams that genuinely get the DevOps concept and to way through that maturity curve, I would say. And what I mean by that is having teams that, again, not only have the ownership of the sort of end-to-end functionality to deliver a particular outcome, but are also taking ownership of all of the layers in the stack. So, it's the application, it's the integration, it's the database, it's the monitoring, it's thinking about the security, the performance, all of those elements that actually come together to generate the total outcome. You need that sense of ownership and responsibility in the team, and you need to make sure you've got the right capabilities in the team to think and execute in that way, or you very quickly start to get friction in the team and or disconnects along the way. And what that meant, at least for our team, is that there's been a fairly significant sort of upskilling and uplift exercise that we've needed to go through to help people actually understand the technologies, the concepts, the ways of working, and to apply some different sort of design principles to the way that solutions are shaped, crafted, and then deployed. So those are sort of the key things as I reflect back on, particularly the last several months of where we've had, challenges and where we've had to lean in really hard to make things work that have jumped out for us. And as we start to get on top of these, I can see our team is now accelerating through the delivery process. So look, that's the pre-prepared part of the conversation. Hopefully have a good day or night.
Yeah.